Joining me now is MST Financial Senior Energy Analyst Saul Kavanagh. Saul, I wanted to get your thoughts on Labor's new gas reservation scheme. The government claims it will push down gas prices by forcing LNG companies to withhold 15 to 20% of what they produce for the domestic market. But what do you make of this plan? Will it work?
Merry Christmas, Caroline. So there's a lot of support in the industry and certainly in the wider Australian community for some sort of reservation to prioritise gas for Australians. That's very clear. Unfortunately, what we've seen again from the Labor government is every time they try and develop a gas policy, they bungle the process and lead to a cacophony of confusion amongst all the stakeholders, which just leads to investment freezes. So perhaps just before I get into the details of the policy, it's worth just looking at the process of how this developed over the last 2 weeks. So this policy was due to be announced early last week. Of course, after the tragedy of the Bondi massacre, the government then called around and said, look, we're going to have to kick this quite understandably into the new year. So it was a pretty big surprise for everyone when this ended up being announced yesterday, right up before Christmas. And I'm afraid quite a few people in the industry are looking at this rather cynically and wondering why the government would announce this as a surprise without all the details being worked out when the Resources Minister herself is actually on holiday, and think that this might have been just the government's attempt to find anything to announce which distracts away from the coverage of their response to the Bondi massacre. If we look at the details of this policy, they've had a whole year to work on this. It's a 104 pages report, and they've not outlined any details of how this works. So the 15 to 25%, they're not clear what it actually applies to. They're not clear how it's going to be split across the 3 projects. They're not clear how they're going to protect contracts when they say they are going to protect contracts. And so this has actually left the industry with more questions than answers, even after having a year to work out all the details. And the truth is they just wanted something to announce, and they've actually kicked this whole policy into next year, subject to further consultation. I'm really not sure what they've been doing throughout the course of this year to not really get to any details of what this policy is really about.
Well, I'd certainly maintain cynicism about that. The timing of it, the fact they want anything to distract from their woeful response to this anti-Semitism epidemic and reluctance to call a royal commission, seems to make sense that they just want to make an announcement, despite a lack of detail. Look, let's talk about wind farms, because after an extended lull in wind farm construction, nearly $2 billion in investments were announced in the past week. These include $650 million from the $650 million investment from the Victorian government-owned SEC for the Delburn wind farm in Gippsland, but we're still nowhere near reaching Labor's goal of 82% renewables by 2030, and the Clean Energy Council says much more is needed. So what do you make of this sudden acceleration in activity, and are we likely to see that continue?
So what's happened is we were on track to see basically no wind farms sanctioned for development in 2025, which would have left an absolute gaping hole in Chris Bowen's narrative about getting to 82% renewables by 2030, which incidentally is impossible. Now, what they've therefore done in the last month is they've provided a flurry of government support, particularly Snowy Hydro signing offtake agreements, which are probably going to have to be over $100 a megawatt hour, which is exceedingly expensive. And there's a reason no one who isn't owned by the government would sign that offtake agreement. And similarly, you've got the Victorian government essentially paying for a wind farm there. So what you're seeing is after a failure to commercially get many of these wind farms up and running, now the government is throwing taxpayer dollars at it, and we're ultimately going to still have to pay for it through higher bills or higher taxes because of this ideological push to meet a target, which is, again, you can speak to anybody who's in the energy industry. Everyone knows it's impossible to meet. And we do have to wonder why we keep throwing money to achieve an arbitrary target, which we still aren't able to get to anyway, particularly in the context where we have rising data center demand, which is very important for Australia, important for our national security and many other things, which is actually going to be driving up power demand, which means we need more reliable power, particularly from gas-firmed renewables, gas and coal, in order to meet our AI and technology priorities. And I think you've seen over the last 6 months actually a shift, at least behind the scenes, in the government where they realise these green targets can't be met and our technology targets need to start taking priority over the ideological green ones.
Well, it's not just, the cost of things and the fact that they're not going to meet the targets. There's the national security concerns too. The Trump administration has halted all offshore wind projects in the US over these concerns. They're worried about the rapid evolution of relevant adversary technologies by these large-scale wind projects. So I'm not sure why we're continuing with the same things without these, which we should have the same concerns, you'd think. Saul Kavanagh, thank you so much for your time and Merry Christmas to you too.